And then Sporanox, I give this drug often by its brand name, but its generic name is itraconazole. And this drug we use a lot of when fluconazole doesn't work. It's more potent. It's been more expensive, though that is very up in the air at this point. And then ketoconazole came out in 1981, and it was the first oral drug we had to treat valley fever in drugs. And prior to that, valley fever was frequently just a death sentence for dogs. They're more likely to not clear this disease out on their own than humans, though we do not have any statistics on how many. And then there's amphotericin B, which is intravenous only in the hospital. And this drug is usually reserved for the most severely ill animals or the ones that aren't responding to these other oral medications that we use routinely. It's expensive, it's a hassle, and it has some pretty negative side effects on the kidney potentially. So how long do we treat animals? Well, there is not a black and white answer to this question. It can depend on how sick the animal is, how well they're responding to the medication. But if we consider an uncomplicated respiratory case that's doing what it's supposed to, 6 to 12 months is pretty average. For a disseminated case that's doing what it's supposed to, 12 to 18 months, and it can vary from a few weeks to the rest of the animal's life. Some of these are going to recur when you take them off medication, no matter how well we treat them, to serologic and radiographic negativity, and I've seen them recur. The literature I've seen is that 30 to 50% of the human disseminated cases will recur no matter how well they're treated. And my experience in dogs is that it seems to be about the same. What do we have in terms of future treatments? One possibility is nifamycin Z, which is being developed at the U of A. In a study, it cured valley fever in mice, and we did a study in dogs, a little study, 9 dogs. And it effectively treated 7 of the 9 dogs that had respiratory valley fever. We only enrolled dogs with respiratory valley fever. And they ranged from mild to severe, the dogs that were enrolled. And we saw no toxicity in the dogs. That was one thing that was really nice about the drug. 3 of those 7 dogs that responded had complete to nearly complete responses with only 2 months of medication. So that was really nice. And Dr. Galdiani, in his talk, is going to talk more about the status of the development of this drug. Can we prevent valley fever? You can move out of Arizona and don't go to California. Dust control is a practical solution in your microenvironment. You can gravel your yard, you can try to plant some grass. Grass is, you water the grass all the time, and it's fairly inhibitory to the valley fever fungus, as best we understand, and it also keeps dust down. You can try to prevent your dogs from digging. We have data that suggests that if you keep them indoors more, you reduce the risk. Probably avoid new construction, though in our research, we were unable to show statistical significance with that, but it could be because our study was too small. As classically, construction is associated with risk. It's associated with a lot of dust and disturbance of natural soils that may be harboring fungal spores. And at the bottom here, I've got vaccine with a question mark, because a vaccine would certainly be a great way to try to prevent valley fever in dogs, and Dr. Galdiani is going to address that in his talk also. So, this is Jackson, who did go on to get better, and he reached his 7th birthday about a month ago, and his mom sent me a little note saying he did, and this is Jackson with his dog family. But in the background, this represents Spider, who was being treated with amphotericin B at the same time, who had approximately the same history as Jackson, came failing fluconazole, also took every oral drug we had, put her on amphotericin B, and while I was at the Valley Fever Study Group meeting, this dog started to seizure. And 48 hours later, her mom decided that this was not a good quality of life for this dog, and she elected to euthanize her. And this reminds us that there is still a lot of work to do in the field of preventing and treating valley fever, which leads us into Dr. Galdiani's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We have time for questions. Anyone have a question? Yes.
Can dogs get a minor case of valley fever like humans do and
Yes.
not know you have it and then,
Yes,
okay.
we did work on that from 2000 to 2003. We enrolled puppies. So we started with 4 to 6 month old dogs who were serologically negative, and we followed them for a year and a half. And what we learned was that 70% of dogs will develop a titer and goes back down, and they're completely asymptomatic, and probably immune, just like people. And that's actually just about the same rate of asymptomatic disease as there is in people.
Yes.
So I kind of had two questions. So you have mentioned about the dog that came in emergency with the seizures that kind of gotten in its brain. Is there really any likelihood that the dog would make it through when it gets to that point? Or is
Absolutely.
okay, so
Put that dog on fluconazole, that dog is fine.
okay. And then you mentioned about cats. So like our cats, they don't go outside. Other than our dogs, tracking in or with our shoes. I'm guessing their exposure is probably pretty minimal.
It's minimal, but we see valley fever in completely indoor cats.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you have to HEPA filter their air,
Right.
completely eliminate the possibility. I mean, the risk is low.
Right.
But I think the spores are in the air. And we do see valley fever in completely indoor cats, which argues that either we're bringing it in on our shoes and they breathe the spores in, or it comes in our air conditioning systems or something like that.
Yes.
Okay, I raise alpaca. My alpaca lately has been dying quite a bit from valley fever. Fluconazole has not been an answer for us.
It's not, because they have a rumen, and I think the reason why we can't get the fluconazole into the bloodstream is because you can't get it to the glandular stomach to get it absorbed.
Are there any other options for us? Because one, the fluconazole has been extremely effective, or expensive and ineffective. So what other options do I have?
Well, you could consider, Dr. Page and I tried subcutaneous amphotericin B on a couple of animals and it didn't help. You could try it earlier before they're in dire straits. You could try intravenous amphotericin B. We tried fluconazole rectally to see if we could get it absorbed, and we weren't getting very good blood levels. Around 3 micrograms per mil was all we could get with the rectal suppositories. One veterinarian in Phoenix, Dr. Orr, who works at the zoo, was giving fluconazole at 20 mg per mil, or 20 mg per kg, and said she was getting some responses at that really high dose, but now that's like, you go broke. You could try compounded, and see if you could get a blood level by going with an extremely high dose. But I think the rumen is the problem with fluconazole and the alpacas.
Now, are you willing to work with an animal and see if you can help us?
Yeah, so far the alpaca and llama people have not really wanted to do anything so far.
Are you suggesting you might?
I might, yes, because I'm losing $20,000 animals to valley fever, and it's ridiculous. So
Yes.
When you say you're having a problem, roughly what number of animals out of how many who you're raising?
we had 36, we're now down to 26, and in the last 2 years, we've lost those 10 to valley fever.
So about a third in 2 years.
Well, and once it gets into them, you lose them, isn't that
And
right?
unfortunately, alpaca don't like to show when they're ill, because again, they're a wild animal. If they show that they're ill, that they become they're an animal for a predator. So they don't show it to us until they're very ill.
Well, and I think that by the time I think they're like the cats. but they really pretty much skip the respiratory phase, and by the time you find it, it's disseminated. So
Yeah.
it's really, really tough to treat.
Well, we see when they're coughing, but we don't know if they're just choking on something that they're eating because it's not a consistent cough. But the time we really notice it is when they get the weakness in the legs. And by then it's probably gone into the bone. So
And-
it's,
And how do you diagnose it?
we have our vet, she runs the blood test, but, again, her recommendation is fluconazole, and then maybe we'll give them some vitamin B, we'll give them some Banamine.
It's because they don't have anything better, that's why. They don't have anything more awesome to offer you.
So can I talk to you later?
Yeah,
Okay,
or I'll give you my email address and we can start a conversation.
okay.
Any other questions? Yes?
So, kind of an ambiguous question, but are you seeing in the dogs, certain breeds that seem to be more susceptible to it or not, or more that you seem to come through? Or?
I think all dogs are susceptible to it. There's some breed predilection for more severe disease.
Okay.
And it's actually historical and well published.
We have some students visiting in the audience who've been very quiet. Any questions about pets and valley fever and pets? Yes.
So there's like the areas where these dogs get the diseases, it corresponds to the human area. The map that we saw earlier.
Where the dogs live?
Yeah. Like
Yes.
where they get the disease.
Yes.
That's a good question. Actually, and one of the points that Heidi was making was that when this disease was first being discovered, and the etiology of this, actually cattle and sheep in the Central Valley of California were sentinel species that they found in slaughterhouses. A lot of evidence of this problem, even though the animals were very, it turns out, are quite resistant to actually getting sick with it. So it was a tip-off. But what parts of the California area, it turns out, was endemic for this infection? Yeah.
Well, that makes me think of Harris Ranch, which is in the Central Valley, and it's the source of most beef eaten in this country. Is valley fever a problem on those massive?
We're talking
The
about
problem with, well, I don't know about the Harris Ranch, but the problem with valley fever and beef, for the beef producers, is partial carcass condemnation. Because where they find it, like in lymph nodes, cattle are super good at walling off valley fever. It gets in them. It doesn't make them sick, but it causes big granulomas. So wherever they find it, when the inspectors come along, that portion of the carcass has to be discarded. So for them, it's a loss of money. As opposed to it killed the cows, they have to throw that piece of carcass away wherever they find it. So, and it's mostly lymph nodes and lungs and things like that. So they're less useful parts of the cow, but it's still a pain. And this I actually learned from the food animal veterinarian here at the U of A.
Is it going into the bones though that might and may possibly undetected? No, because they don't. It doesn't.
Not that I've heard. Not that I've heard. I don't know I won't say absolutely not, but not that I've heard.
But there wouldn't be any contamination risk from a human being eating meat that had gotten into the system undetected, contaminated with valley fever. There's not. It doesn't go into humans that way.
You can't get it that way.
Okay.
You can't get valley fever that way. So there's no illness risk. So hopefully you're not eating your meat raw anyway.
Well, even if you are,
There's a lot of other things that
A lot of people do.
that you can
Just-
get that you shouldn't be eating meat raw.
just to reassure people, this situation has been ongoing for the last century. And people who get valley fever are not found because meat's been shipped to Washington State or Oregon or anywhere else. You really have to have endemic exposure almost completely. Actually, there have been examples of bales of cotton being shipped to Egypt Pima continent to Egypt, and planes landing in Heathrow in London, and people at the locations where those planes and the cotton bales went, getting valley fever from those dirt on the plane or dirt on the bales of cotton. But that's the dirt part of the vector. It's not ever been documented from transmission of any kind of butcher meat. Any other comments? Yeah.
I had heard from that the valley fever spores are very small, but they're heavy. So when it rains and then it washes dirt down the street, don't let my dog sniff at the dirt down the street because there would be more spores at the end because they're heavy. Do you know if that's true? You know, I was just curious.
I think they're really light. They actually move around. Yeah, they get into the air and don't settle very quickly at all. But I think the risk of sniffing in the dirt is real.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that, Lisa?
Yeah, the risk of slipping in the dirt is real. The spores are light.
Lisa, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate your
Sure.
coming by and doing this. Lisa's going to stay.
I'm in the back.
She's in the back. She's not running away. And after my sort of set of remarks here, she'll still be here. So if there are other questions that you think of that you want to ask Lisa, she'll be around to help with answering them. So my topic is what is the Valley Fever Center doing across Arizona? And I'd like to recycle my slides too, but I've added a little something to this one. And I have some trouble showing this slide in Phoenix. Because I think you can see I made the U of A's logo just a little bit bigger. It is to highlight the fact that these yellow areas are really the endemic parts. Here's the San Joaquin Valley, here's where we live. And now the University of Arizona has 2 colleges of medicine in the hyper-endemic region for this disease. Here as the original, and now a second fully accredited, or in the process of becoming a fully accredited College of Medicine, 4-year college in downtown Phoenix, both of the University of Arizona. So it is really the only major research university in the country, and for that matter, the world, that has its colleges of medicine right at the heart of the problem. And it was, I thought, a very good reason to take focus of that in Arizona. So I actually have been here since 78. And in 1995, I had my one and only sabbatical. I'd like to say, has anyone ever taken a sabbatical? Not a single, oh yeah, there you go, Lisa. One other person. Let me just tell you that youth is wasted on the young. A sabbatical is a concept where you basically don't have to, people don't tell you what to do for a period of time before you go back. And magic happens, chemistry happens in your brain when you have that kind of a fallow period. And it was in 95 that I realized that I was actually quite interested in this disease, but what we really needed in Arizona was a lot more. We needed an institutional commitment to that. And it was for that reason that I convinced the Board of Regents that we needed a Valley Fever Center of excellence here in Arizona, and they agreed with me. So that happened the following year in 1996. Since then, I think I can show you some expanded research that is because more and more scientists here and other investigators got interested in this disease, so we've expanded the research base. Then in 2003, we had our first Valley Fever Awareness Week, of which this is actually now the 11th. And we've done that with this community outreach program every year, most of the time here in Tucson. In 2008, we wanted to go even further and created a a sort of various initiatives that we put under the rubric Valley Fever Corridor Project. This was to increase understanding and do more outreach, assist in clinical research, and improve patient care with the rubric or the acronym of Valley Fever Alliance of Arizona Clinicians, or VFAC. It's a terrible acronym, but we couldn't think of a better one, and so that's what we're stuck with. So the VFAC, or Valley Fever Alliance, its purpose was, first of all, when there were patients, it was basically a communication network. It was not an actual medical practice of any sort. It took clinicians from across the state in various specialties so they could talk to each other. And one of the reasons to do it was to take patients who needed help, to have a mechanism through the Valley Fever Center for Excellence here to try to connect them with doctors as close as possible to where they lived. And then also for doctors who had problems with their own patients to be able to find a subspecialist that was appropriate. But as I showed you earlier in my introduction, some of these patients get very complicated. You don't need one subspecialist, they might need 3, 4, 5, or more different areas: surgeons, rehabilitation, radiologists, neuroradiologists, ophthalmologists. It gets very complicated in some of these patients. And so specialists actually need to know who else in the field, in a different specialty, might be able to help them with their patients. So this was kind of the overall concept of the Alliance. But it still wasn't actually a way to directly help patients who were sick. And this is an article from the Arizona Republic announcing in 2007 that we had agreed on creating such an entity. This was a partnership that was developed in Phoenix between the University of Arizona and St. Joseph's Hospital. And it was agreed to in the late summer, early fall of 2011, and it opened its doors the following year, in June 2012. As I say, St. Joseph's Hospital is the oldest hospital in the state. It has this long-standing commitment to the community, which I thought was attractive. It has a couple of surgical groups, Barrow, in particular Barrow Neurologic, which is a very valuable resource for patients that need neurosurgery on the spine, or they have coccymeningitis and need surgical help. So for a variety of reasons, it made sense. And it's right in downtown Phoenix. And I live in Tucson, but it made, when 80% of the state's disease is in the Maricopa County area, if you're going to have a clinical center, it made the most sense that the Valley Fever Center for Excellence, which is based at the U of A, should establish its clinical center in where the patients are. So we chose Phoenix to do that. And it's really a partnership, not only with the hospital, but the College of Medicine in Phoenix and the Valley Fever Center, and also the community, because the community is going to have to support this to help us grow this center as we hope to do. So I actually put together just some statistics on the first year of what the center has been able to help. It's answered 420 inquiries, mostly by phone, but a few by email. And as you might expect, being in Arizona, 60% of the calls and queries came from Arizona, distributed mostly between Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima counties. But we're also getting inquiries, and we're trying to help people in California, 3% in Washington and Texas, less in Utah, Colorado, New York, and less than 1%, but represent another 22 states where questions about this disease were coming. And in fact, there have been calls from Canada, Australia, Italy, Spain, and Argentina, which is coming full circle. I mentioned that was where the first case of the disease occurred, and it's still there. So the kinds of patients that have been seen in the clinic, the first quarter actually thought they had valley fever, or somebody thought they had valley fever, and they didn't. They might have had it, but at the point that we saw them in clinic, they had no active infection. And we could tell them that and tell them the reasons why we we see that they have no infection. So they could stop worrying about what was bothering them, whatever it was due to this infection, and if they needed help, find it where it was more appropriate. Then a third of patients had the kind of illness that Kim Knox was showing you. Be very careful with that table. I don't want to see if an apple breaks when you let it fall 3 feet. I digress. Let me tell you about, so this third that have mild valley fever, these people had already been diagnosed, but they weren't happy with the care they had gotten, either because the physician didn't know what to tell them, or because they didn't know, they just didn't connect. And my experience with these patients is they actually there's lots of good news for many of them. Some of them actually had complications that needed to be addressed differently, but most of them, once they had an education and understood what the disease was all about, got much better just by education alone in most cases. In addition to that, it turns out, some of you may know that fatigue is often the very most impacting symptom. Everything else has gone away, and for some patients, fatigue doesn't. And we've actually developed a program which is primarily based on reconditioning and redeveloping muscle strength, because these patients often are very deconditioned, and the symptoms of deconditioning is what they had been thinking was actually an active infection. So once we transferred that idea from it being active infection to something you could actually do something about, that actually has been enormously helpful for a number of these patients. But then there are also complicated valley fever, 22%, and then spread of the infection out of the lungs to other parts of the body, 15%. So these are much higher as you'd expect in a referral kind of situation. You get the harder cases coming here. But this is the whole spectrum of the illness as it hits the state. So this is the hub of the wheel. The idea is that this is, yes, it's in Phoenix, but it's meant to be a statewide activity. We are involving, using the Valley Fever Alliance of Arizona clinicians, we're involving doctors across the state. And in fact, it conceivably could expand. I'm targeting this state first, but why not just have it also be helpful elsewhere as well? We're offering to our colleagues that we can have a single electronic medical record, so the complicated patients, all their records will be in one place for all the treating physicians to use. And a central tenet is that for this disease, one person will be in charge of the management plan. So there'll be a go-to person. Often what happens with complicated diseases is that the patient gets moved between different doctors and there's no integration of the care. And so adding a case management service to the plan to make sure that it's integrated is another part of the strategy for this grand design for what we call the Valley Fever Center in Phoenix, but which we really want to make available across the entire state. So this is sort of the clinical network that we're talking about. We're trying to do more with the tools we already have, and I think examples have been given already about how things could be improved in delivery of care. I agree with that completely. We're trying to do that. And educating people, there's Arizona Department of Health data to show that people who know more about this disease before they get sick have a shorter time to diagnosis than people who don't know about this disease before they get sick. As if they're asking their doctor, shouldn't you test me for valley fever? And so, the education should be both in the healthcare profession, but also in the community as well, like we're doing today. But once this is fully underway, this actually becomes a platform for clinical research. If you have this interactive effect of encouraging the fungus to go to sleep or become dormant, and when that happens, people heal and they feel better, the inflammation goes away, and that's a good thing. but it's not actually curing the infection. And so some people, if you stop treatment, relapse. So in non-central nervous system disease, the relapse rate of roughly 30%, or in meningitis, 3/4. And there's a publication of 14 out of 17 patients who stopped, who had cocci-meningitis, had recurrence off treatment, which leads to the recommendation that patients with cocci-meningitis never stop treatment, ever, no matter how well they do. So that's kind of the state of the art. This is a discussion then about this drug, Nicomycin Z, which actually the University of Arizona is the sponsor of. We'll talk about why that's the case. These are two pictures. This is a picture of the molecule. This is a picture of a sugar called UDP N-acetylglucosamine. Now, that is a bead on the chain of a polysaccharide called chitin. And the enzyme that takes these sugars and puts them together to make a polysaccharide is called chitin synthase. This picture looks a lot like this picture. Without being a, carbohydrate chemist, the shape of these look very similar. And in fact, the way this drug works is by competing with this substrate for the place on that enzyme. So it inhibits the growth of the chitin synthase. It inhibits the enzyme's function, chitin synthase's function. And that's a unique mechanism in clinical medicine. No other drugs have been brought to clinical trials with that mechanism. So Lisa alluded to doing mouse trials with this. She actually has done her own studies, which is now hopefully very close to being published. This is data from back in the 1990s from a good friend of ours, Rich Hector, who now treating mice, if he didn't give them any drug, but infected them by putting intranasally spores into the lung system, 8 of those animals predictably died with 2 million spores in their lungs. A very overwhelming fatal infection. In contrast, the mice who got Nicomycin Z as an oral treatment, 7 of them had no organisms recoverable from the lungs, and only one unit of the fungus was found in the 8th organism. So it was like night and day between these two treatment groups. And just because of that difference, it could be a 180-degree turnaround in the approach we would take. As you might have heard, general approach is, since so many people get better, let's not try to treat people if we don't have to because they're going to get better, and only really take care of the people who have complications and then manage them as a chronic disease. If you had a cure for this disease, the whole thing would shift. Now you want to diagnose the disease as early as possible, treat them as early as possible to prevent, to cure it, so that the complications wouldn't occur. So it's very exciting, theoretically, if we could translate what looks to be the case in mice into clinical trials. So this drug really was discovered 40 years ago by the German pharmaceutical Bayer. It was found to have this therapeutic effect for our disease in mice back in the 1980s. It actually started development with a company called Shaman Pharmaceuticals. Does anyone reach deep? Does anyone ever remember hearing about Shaman Pharmaceuticals? Anyone listen to Nova? It was on Nova. It was a company, it was a startup in South San Francisco that called themselves Shaman Pharmaceuticals because they went to the rainforest and talked to medicine men and asked what works. And that was their point of discovery, to find out what molecules were in there. Anyway, but they started development in the 1990s, but then went out of business in 2000, which kind of slowed things down. It does that when you close. And actually, since 2000, it was sitting around waiting for somebody to restart development until the University of Arizona stepped forward in 2005. So since 2005, over the past 8 years, in various ways, we've garnered about $8 million. It's been done both by the University of Arizona and by a small company which was spun off called Valley Fever Solutions, of which I'm actively involved as a chief medical officer. We were able to get grants, both at the U of A and also small business grants by Valley Fever Solutions from the NIH. We had some FDA money to the University of Arizona to fund a clinical trial, and a Manhattan, New York-based foundation called the J.T. Thai Company Foundation has now funded us over the past 8 years $2.4 million for helping us with this drug development. This foundation is in Manhattan, New York. Did I say it was in New York? That's not exactly right in the middle of the endemic region.
Was he infected?
No, he wasn't. No, he is no longer around. It's their board that decided on that because they heard about this disease and decided it was very important. So by a variety of means, we've been able to pull together this sort of money to restart clinical investigation. We have completed a multi-dose, 14-day phase 1, which is basically looking at safety and also the blood levels that you get when people take this. So it's in humans. At this point, there is no toxicity concerns. And from the blood levels and the pharmacokinetics that we developed, we have lots of reasons to think that drug levels we could achieve in people could be very similar to those that are effective in mice and the dog study actually that Lisa referred to that she had completed. So we're very optimistic about moving forward to clinical trials to see how well it works. But before you can do that, you need to make more drug. There's no pharmaceutical company involved. You don't just turn to whoever and say, could I have some more drug, please? You have to make it. And we've been spending actually the last 3 years just doing that, creating a process. And now we're in place to actually start applying that manufacturing process. And we expect we'll have completed full verification of the method by next spring, have clinically usable drug in the fall of 2014, and our target is to start phase 2 clinical trials in early 2015 with additional grant funding. So that's where we are with this. We constantly are looking for additional pharmaceutical partnership because we could accelerate this process dramatically if we were not running on the $1 million a year budget. If you do drug development, it takes a lot more upfront to get to market. We'll touch on that when I look at some numbers. So let's then turn to the question of preventing valley fever. Melissa alluded to the possibility of a vaccine, which is such a cool idea because so many people get over this on their own. There is such a good immune response so often. It's very tempting to think that you could create a vaccine which would do exactly the same thing that an infection does without having to be infected. So one way to prevent the disease is simply don't breathe it. It actually works pretty well, but it's kind of short term. Don't live here. Lisa alluded to that. I think that's a possibility, but this is, let me just say, my feeling is this is one of many issues that people would make to deciding where they're going to live. If we could do, for instance, Heidi talked about if we knew exactly where this was in the dirt or many other kinds of things about the fungus in the environment, perhaps we'd be able to have risk reduction strategies before we get infected. And that's also good. But the thing I want to talk about now is vaccines. There has been a valley fever vaccine project in activity for the last 15 years. And in fact, we developed a vaccine which we thought would be perfectly good to go to clinical trials. It was based on making a protein, a recombinant protein, and then it was very protective in some species of mice. Lisa showed us that. The problem was that taking it from the experimental discovery into a formulation that you would feel comfortable using as a formulation for clinical trials is an enormously expensive proposition for taking recombinant proteins. And it at this point is maybe an insurmountable hurdle for that strategy at this point in time. The market size for a vaccine for this disease is so small compared to, think of other vaccines that are on the market. Influenza, polio, measles. I mean, these are worldwide markets, and it's hard to get a business model together around it. However, a different approach has developed, which has always been theoretically an interesting approach, but I've now started to think actually it has legs and actually ought to be pursued seriously. It's based on, and the approach is to take a live